Imagine a tiny hospital room lit by a single crooked lamp, the kind that throws long shadows across the bed, and imagine two hands, one trembling from disease and one steady from choice, meeting over a thin blanket. That first image is the whole argument of this story, that there are illnesses medicine can name and treat, but there are wounds only a human heart knows how to close. Picture it, a close-up of a face half hidden by tubes, eyes catching like wet glass, and someone whispering a name that medicine forgot to write on a chart. That whisper is the first crack in the neat armor modern science builds round us. It's where everything starts to move. I'll tell you something honest. People think healing is a ladder, tests, diagnosis, treatment, recovery. But life loves to be messy, and people are more like rivers, bending, splitting, freezing in parts when the weather of grief or loneliness comes. Therefore, the story I want to pull you into isn't about charts or prescriptions. It's about the work that happens in the margins, bedside stories, music hummed low, hands that refuse to let go. That's the conflict, when the strongest medicine reaches its limit. What steps forward, love? Not a romanticized headline love, but the stubborn, small, daily insistence of showing up. Let me set a scene. A middle-aged man named Jonah, once a carpenter who could make a door sing, now reduced to the cadence of hospital monitors. You can see the rain of his life in the grooves of his hands. They are maps of good, hard labor. He's been told the word that everyone fears, chronic, relentless, and the doctors are careful and precise. But their precision doesn't answer the question that keeps Jonah awake at 2 a.m. Who am I when my hands don't work the way they used to? Therefore enters Mia, his sister, who refuses to read his diagnosis like a full stop. She treats Jonah the way he treated his own work, with patient attention and a stubborn belief in possibility. We need to understand, early, that this is not a tidy movie plot. The dance I use here will alternate calm and crisis, because real stories earn tension by bouncing between what is and what could be. Jonah's days are a series of small defeats, his spilled cup, a missed hammer stroke. But in those small failures there's a seed of narrative. Mia notices the tiny patterns medicine misses, the way Jonah hums the same fragment of a song when he's afraid, the way his eyes glance to the window where a maple tree waits. Therefore, she leans into ritual, bringing a mug he once loved, playing an old radio station, tracing the lines on his palms as if reading them for weather. These are acts of care that no chart captures, and they begin to change how Jonah measures his own life. Now pause and ask yourself, why does love work as medicine when medicine alone stumbles? The straightforward answer is human connection's power to recalibrate the nervous system. But the deeper truth is narrative. When we tell stories to one another of who we used to be, of the joke that made us laugh until we cried, we re-anchor identity. Therefore, Mia collects fragments of Jonah's life, a splinter of wood from his workshop, a photograph with paint on the edge, a postcard from a trip he never took, and she weaves them into a new story where Joe is still the maker. The hospital room becomes a stage. The fourth stand is a lamp in a carpenter's shed. The monitor's beep becomes a metronome to a rhythm he once knew. This restoring is not denial, it's a reclaiming. It's a therapeutic art that medicine cannot prescribe. Let's zoom in on a short scene. Jonah attempts to lift his mug. His hand, once so reliable, trembles. He frowns, small, impatient, and for a moment the room is full of the quiet language of loss. Mia watches, breath held. But what she does next is surprising. She doesn't chastise or pity. She tells a silly story about the mug. how it swam across a flea market table like a tiny ship, how Jonah negotiated its purchase with a grin. Therefore, Jonah laughs, a wet, surprised sound, and the mug lifts a fraction higher. It's barely enough to notice, but it's enough. That fraction is a hinge on which the plot turns. Because we're telling this in a way that lives and breathes, with sentences that skip and pulse, I'll keep the rhythm shifting. Short sentences long. A question thrown like a pebble. Have you ever watched someone relearn themselves? It's a staggered, poetic violence. There are stumbles and soft recoveries. Jonah's body is the site of struggle, but his story is the scaffold Mia builds round him. Therefore, they begin to practice together, daily motion exercises that look more like a duet than therapy. Mia guides, Jonah resists, then, slowly, he cooperates. The therapist applauds the measurable progress, but the real change is quieter. Jonah starts dreaming in smallness again. Wood shavings, a crooked nail, the shape of a bird he once whittled. Here's another image to hold, sunlight on wood dust. The dust becomes a constellation of possibility. Jonah watches it and recognizes himself in the pattern. That recognition is a minor miracle that medicine didn't plan for. Medicine measured his muscles and his blood work, but it didn't map his hunger for meaning. Therefore, Mia draws out stories with questions that are not clinical. What joke did Dad always ruin at Christmas? Which song made you feel brave? When the saw slipped? These questions seem to drift away from diagnosis, but they are precisely the therapy he needs. We'll also meet Dr. Patel, who represents clinical care done well, careful, compassionate, sometimes limited. He prescribes exercises, monitors vitals, offers realistic goals. He says things like, "We can improve function, but we must be realistic." Those are the sentences that hold both truth and a kind of finality. Jonah hears them and feels the space close, but the narrative's tension is in what happens next. Mia refuses to accept finality as fate. She treats reality as something to be negotiated with tenderness. Therefore, she invites neighbors, former clients, and the town's old musicians to visit. The hospital room blooms with testimonies, songs, stories, small repairs done round a chair. Each visitor is a brushstroke that alters Jonah's portrait. Medicine called it a condition, but the town remembers the life. You might be wondering if this is sentimental. Good question. The point isn't to make pain beautiful for its own sake. The point is honest. Humans heal in community. Therefore, we see Jonah not cured by love alone. That would be fairy tale thinking, but changed in ways medicine can't quantify. He learns patience. He learns to accept help. He learns a new kind of pride that isn't tied to perfect competence but to showing up. The stakes are real, and the resolution will not be trivial. There will be losses. There will be wins that look like small unions with a former self. Now, here's a pivot. Sometimes the people who give love are the ones who need healing too. Mia is not invulnerable. She carries her own small, quiet grief, the resentment of time wasted in arguments, the ache of a sister who always left early for the job. She comes as fiercely present because she knows what's at risk. Her care is not a pure altruism. It's also a reparative labor. The point is tenderness is not free. It costs courage to stay. Jonah's acceptance of help will ask him to give up a brittle independence, but it will also offer him a new story where he's known and supported. Therefore, the dance between them, push, resist, lean, accept, creates a reverse mirror where both are transformed. So here's the hook. Love shows up like a patient craftsman, with tools that aren't patented or taught in medical school. Tools like stories, steady presence, ritual, and radical listening. It doesn't replace medicine. It fills the spaces medicine leaves behind. That's the core tension I'll carry forward. We'll watch how small practices, an old song, a repaired mug, a neighbor's visit, begin to shape measurable change, and we'll test the limits of whether belonging can rewrite a body's history. The first beat of this tale ends on that image, Jonah's shaky hand, the mug, the laugh that shifts the room's weight. It's a small thing, but it's a promise. Therefore, we begin with this promise and move into the work of keeping it. Outside the window, the hospital maple tree had started shedding. Leaves fell like quiet applause, a soft rustling sound that almost matched the slow, patient rhythm of Jonah's breathing. Mia sat beside him, watching the reflection of those leaves in the glass. For weeks, she had counted time not in hours or medications but in gestures, how long it took Jonah to smile, how deep his sighs went before sleep found him. She had learned that healing didn't look like a miracle. It looked like waiting. But waiting can be brutal. There were mornings when Jonah's body refused to cooperate, when his hands wouldn't hold the spoon, when his voice came out as a thin rasp instead of a sentence. On those mornings, the silence between them felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Mia tried to fill that silence with stories about the neighbor's new dog, about how their childhood treehouse still leaned to one side. Yet sometimes her voice cracked, and Jonah would notice. He'd watch her, eyes narrowed with worry, even in his weakness. "You don't have to pretend, Mia," he'd whisper. "I know this is hard on you too." That was the paradox of love. It didn't just give, it revealed. She wanted to protect him from sadness, but his honesty forced her to admit her own exhaustion. Therefore, she began to let the truth breathe between them. Instead of pretending everything was fine, she'd say, "Yeah, today sucks," and Jonah, surprising her, would laugh. "Good," he'd answer. "Then we're honest. Doctor." Patel noticed the change. When he came for rounds, he observed how Jonah's mood had shifted. The charts didn't show miracles, but something invisible had started to align. Mood influences biology. He said, half to himself. "You keep this up, and we might be rewriting parts of your prognosis." Mia smiled, but Jonah shook his head. "No," he said softly. "We're just learning to live again, every few days." Mia brought new pieces of the outside world to him, wood scraps from his workshop, sandpaper, small tools that had once been extensions of his hands. She'd lay them on the table by his bed. "You don't have to use them," she'd say. "Just remember what they feel like." The first time Jonah touched one of the tools, his fingers hesitated, then closed gently round the handle. It was an awkward grip, but it was real. He looked up at Mia and smiled with that half-lost expression of a man remembering who he was. "Do you ever think," he asked, "that love is a muscle too?" Mia blinked. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, eyes drifting to the window, "when you don't use it, it weakens. But when someone reminds you how, it grows stronger again." That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She walked the hospital halls, past other rooms filled with their own quiet dramas. The mother humming to a premature baby, the man with flowers asleep in a chair, the nurse fixing a blanket with gentle precision. Every door was another story of love trying to outpace medicine. And she thought, maybe this is what hospitals really are. Temples of endurance. Not just for patients, but for everyone who loves them. As the days blended into each other, something shifted inside Jonah. The pain remained, but it became less tyrannical. He began to ask about the world outside, the weather, the neighbors, whether the shop on Main Street still sold those ridiculous pies. These questions were small, but therefore monumental. They meant his curiosity was returning, and with it, the will to live beyond the diagnosis. One afternoon, Mia found him sitting upright, trying to sand a small block of wood she'd brought. His movements were slow, unsteady, but the sound, that soft, gritty rhythm, filled the room with life. She wanted to cry, but instead she laughed. "You're going to get us kicked out for making sawdust in here," she teased. Jonah looked at her with mock seriousness. "Then they'll have to call it art therapy." That became their inside joke. Every small rebellion against despair was art therapy. When Jonah managed to tie his gown without help, art therapy. When he managed to hold a fork, art therapy. When he remembered a story from their childhood, art therapy again. Humor became their prescription. The laughter wasn't denial. It was defiance. But love isn't all light. There was a night when Jonah collapsed, his body betraying him again. The alarm screamed, the nurses rushed in, and Mia froze in the corner, her heart trapped somewhere, between prayer and panic. She watched as Dr. Patel and the team worked in a blur of motion, their faces tight with focus. When the chaos settled, Jonah was stable, barely. Mia sat by his bed, gripping his limp hand. "You promised me," she whispered through tears. "You said we were learning to live." When Jonah woke hours later, pale but conscious, he saw red eyes and smiled weakly. "I didn't break the promise," he murmured, just. Paused the lesson. That line, soft, half-joking, carved itself into Mia's memory. It was his way of telling her that setbacks didn't erase progress. They were part of the rhythm. And that's what healing turned out to be. Not a straight line, but a dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Context and conflict, hope and doubt. The same pattern that defines every real story. Mia began to see it clearly. Every setback was an invitation to love more honestly, not more perfectly. Weeks later, the doctors decided Jonah was strong enough to leave the hospital. The maple tree outside had lost all its leaves, standing bare and unapologetic. As the nurse wheeled Jonah toward the exit, he reached out to touch the cold glass. "Looks dead," he said quietly. Mia shook her head. "No, just resting. Everything that looks still is just gathering strength." Jonah smiled at that, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes. "Then maybe that's what I've been doing too." It was a poetic line, but it was true. He had been resting, not surrendering. As they drove home, the town seemed smaller, humbler, like it had been waiting for him. The streets were lined with familiar houses, the scent of wood smoke curling through the winter air. When they reached his old workshop, Jonah insisted on stopping. Mia hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I need to see it. Inside." The workshop was dustier than she remembered. The tools still hung neatly on the wall, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. Jonah reached out, tracing the outline of a hammer. His fingers trembled, but the gesture was steady in meaning. "This place kept me alive once," he said. "Maybe it can do it again." That was the first hint of the next chapter. The idea that love and purpose were not separate medicines, but halves of the same cure. Jonah would not just survive. He would create again. And in doing so, he would teach Mia and everyone watching, that healing is not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming someone new, with all the scars included. The light from the workshop window fell on his face like a quiet blessing. Mia stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You ready?" she asked. Jonah smiled faintly. "Not yet," he said. "But I'm getting there, and that's where we leave them, for now, on the edge of a new beginning, the ethic with sawdust and promise, love humming like a low, steady grunt beneath everything medicine couldn't fix. If you are ready, say asterisk asterisk continue 3 asterisk asterisk, and I'll unfold asterisk asterisk block 3 asterisk asterisk, where Jonah faces the world beyond the hospital. Love begins to meet resistance, and the line between healing and letting go starts to blur. The morning light spilled into Jonah's workshop like a promise kept long. Dust motes floated in the beams, slow and deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to move at his new rhythm. Mia opened the window, letting the cool air rush in, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Jonah sat by his old workbench, tracing the scars in the wood surface. With his thumb, each one a story of something built, something broken, something learned. "Feel smaller," he muttered. "It's the same," Mia said, setting down a thermos of coffee. "You just got bigger." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just see it different now. That was the thing about recovery. It changed the way you measured the world. Before the illness, Jonah's worth had been tied to what he could make, the precision of his hands, the certainty of his craft. Now, everything felt like it was written in slow ink. He couldn't swing a hammer like he used to, couldn't lift the heavy oak boards without his arms shaking. But he could still touch, still see, still feel. And maybe that was enough to start with. At first, the workshop felt haunted. By silence, by the echo of who he used to be. The tools looked at him like old friends, unsure how to say hello. The sawdust smelled like memory. Mia sensed his hesitation. "You don't have to fix everything today," she said. Jonah nodded double quotes here. He said, "But I have to start," and so he did. Awkwardly, gently, stubbornly. His hands fumbled with nails. His breathing grew shallow. But every small victory, a cut made straight, a board fitted perfectly, was a prayer. He worked for an hour, then 2, resting between breaths. When he finally stepped back, he'd built something small, a birdhouse, crooked but whole. He smiled, exhausted. "Art therapy," he whispered, and Mia laughed until her eyes watered. The birdhouse became a symbol. They hung it outside his window that afternoon, and within days, his sparrow moved in. It was a silly coincidence, maybe, but for Jonah it felt like a sign, proof that life still found its way back to him. "Guess I'm still useful," he said quietly. "You are never not," Mia replied. But healing, as always, demanded a cost. The bills piled up. Mia had taken leave from work to care for him, and her savings were thin. Jonah noticed, of course. "You need to go back," he told her one night. "I'm not leaving you." "I didn't say leave," he said. "Just live. Don't let me be your whole world." That line hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, to remind him that family means showing up. But deep down, she knew he was right. Her life had shrunk to the size of his recovery. Love can heal, yes, but it can also consume. Therefore, she began to find a balance. Mornings with Jonah, afternoons freelancing from a laptop, evenings walking by the lake to clear her mind. Meanwhile, Jonah began to test his limits. He joined a local support group for people recovering from chronic illnesses. It met every Thursday in the church basement, a room that smelled like coffee and second chances. At first, he just listened. The stories were raw and polished. One woman talked about losing her husband. Another man spoke about learning to walk again. Jonah realized something profound. Everyone there had lost a version of themselves, yet they were all still here, stubbornly. Alive. One afternoon, a new member named Clara joined. She was younger than the rest, a nurse who'd left her job after a burnout that nearly broke her. She listened to Jonah's story, nodding quietly. "You ever think," she said, "that sometimes healing is just remembering how to be human again?" Jonah smiled. "I think I'm still figuring out what that means." Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened. Clara had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like therapy but still cut deep. She challenged him, asked why he kept his pain so private, why he downplayed his progress, why he flinched when people offered help. "Independence is noble," she said one day, "but isolation isn't." That sentence lingered. Jonah thought about it long after she left. He realized that he'd built his whole life like one of his birdhouses, sturdy, self-contained, sealed tight. But real healing, he was beginning to learn, required openings, windows, doors. Other hands. One morning, he surprised Mia by announcing, "I want to teach again." She blinked. Teach what would work? Maybe small classes. Kids, beginners. Nothing fancy. Just showing people how to make something with their hands. Mia smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "That's beautiful." Jonah, the next weeks were a blur of preparation. Jonah cleared the workshop, fixed the lights, sanded the benches. Word spread through town faster than he expected. By the time he opened the doors, 6 people showed up. 3 kids, 2 retirees, and Clara, who came with a notebook and a shy smile. The first session was chaos. Nails bent, boards split. One boy cried because his birdhouse fell apart. Jonah's hands trembled with fatigue halfway through, and he had to sit down. But when class ended, something magical happened. Every single student stayed to help clean up. Clara handed him a cup of tea and said, "You did it." "Barely," he replied. "That's the point," she said. "Healing doesn't mean never breaking again. It means you keep building anyway." That night, Jonah wrote those words on a scrap of wood and nailed it above his workbench. Keep building anyway. It became his new philosophy, a quiet mantra against despair. But just as the rhythm began to feel steady, life tested him again. Winter arrived harsh and sudden. The cold seeped into his joints, slowing his progress. He caught a fever one night, mild at first, but enough to scare Mia. She sat by his bed, holding his hand as the snow fell outside. "I hate this," she whispered. "Every time it feels like we're moving forward, something pulls us back." Jonah opened his eyes, weak but clear. "That's just life doing its job," he said, "making sure we remember why moving forward matters." There was silence then, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but sacred. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying everything in white, soft forgiveness. The next morning, he woke to sunlight breaking through the frost. The fever had passed. He turned his head toward the window, watching the sparrow hop along the sill. "Still here," he whispered. Mia smiled. Both of you, in that fragile moment. Jonah understood something he hadn't before. Healing was never about erasing pain. It was about learning to live beautifully beside it. The scars didn't fade, but they no longer ruled him. His story had found its rhythm again, steady, imperfect, real. And as he drifted back to sleep, the sunlight spilling over his workbench, one truth pulsed quietly through the room. Love doesn't always fix what's broken. Sometimes it teaches you to build something sacred from the pieces. The workshop had become a heartbeat, quiet but steady, pulsing through the little town like a song that people didn't realize they were humming until they passed by. Children came with sawdust on their shoes and stories in their pockets. Retirees brought memories that smelled like varnish and time. And Jonah, once a man marked by decline, had become the center of it all, his laughter echoing through wood beams that had waited too long to hear it again. Every class started the same way. Jonah would look round the room, his hands folded like a prayer, and say, "We're not here to make perfect things. We're here to make honest ones." The line became his gospel. Imperfection wasn't failure anymore. It was proof of life. Mia stood at the edge of the room, watching. She saw how the students leaned in when Jonah spoke, how his confidence grew with every project completed. The man who once stared at the ceiling in a hospital bed was now helping others find meaning through motion. Yet behind her smile, Mia carried a quiet ache, the awareness that healing, no matter how luminous, was fragile. That fragility showed itself one cold afternoon when Jonah dropped a plank of wood. His hand spasmed without warning, a ghost of the illness reminding him who was still in charge. The sound, sharp and sudden, froze everyone. Jonah stood there, jaw clenched, fighting the old shame that tried to crawl back into his chest. Clara was the first to move. She knelt beside him, steady and calm. "You okay?" He nodded, though his eyes were glassy. "Yeah, just a misfire." But it wasn't just that. It was fear, the fear that all his progress could vanish, that the version of himself he'd rebuilt could collapse with a single tremor. That night, he didn't come to dinner. Mia found him in the workshop hours later, sitting in the dark, his hand wrapped in a towel though there was no blood. "I thought I'd left it behind," he said, voice low. "The weakness, the trembling, you didn't leave it," she said softly. "You learned to live with it," he sighed. "Some days, I still hate this body, then hate it," she said, stepping closer. "But don't forget to thank it afterward. It's still carrying you." There was silence, a fragile, heavy kind. Before Jonah whispered, "You sound like a poet." "Maybe I've been listening to one for too long," she said with a tired smile. That moment marked something subtle but real. Jonah began to understand that healing wasn't a finish line. It was a practice. Some days you sang, some days you cursed, but you kept showing up. In the following weeks, he taught less about woodworking and more about resilience. He introduced failure days, sessions where students had to deliberately mess up their projects, then find creative ways to fix them. It became a metaphor so clear that even the kids got it. "Like you," one girl said shyly after class. "You fixed yourself." Jonah laughed softly. "Still fixing," he said. "Always fixing." Clara stayed after class that evening. "You're teaching more than you realize," she said. "They're not just building things. They're learning to forgive themselves." Jonah leaned against the table, tired but content. "Funny," he said. "I think I'm learning that too." Mia watched all of this from a quiet distance. She had returned to work part-time, yet she still came by every evening. But something inside her was shifting, a sense that her role was changing. For so long, she had been the caretaker, the anchor. Now Jonah was becoming the steady one. It was beautiful, but it also scared her. Who was she when she wasn't needed? One evening, she brought it up. "You don't need me the same way anymore," she said, trying to make it sound like a joke. Jonah smiled. "No, but I still want you here. There's a difference. That distinction, need versus want, settled in her chest like a seed. It was the purest kind of love, chosen, not required." As spring approached, the town began to notice the ripple effect of Jonah's little classroom. The mayor visited one day, curious. Local teachers invited Jonah to speak at the high school. His story traveled quietly, person to person, like a rumor of hope. The carpenter who healed through kindness, they called him. Jonah hated the label, but he couldn't deny its truth. One Friday, after class, Clara suggested they build something together. Something for the town. A bench, she said, where people can rest. Maybe near the park, Jonah agreed. It felt symbolic, a place for weary people to sit and breathe, to remember they weren't alone. They worked on it for weeks, the entire class helping sand, polish, and carve a simple inscription across the backrest. Still here, the words came from Jonah, of course. He said they were for anyone who'd ever felt like giving up, a reminder that surviving itself was an act of art. When the bench was unveiled, the whole town showed up. There were tears, laughter, camera flashes, and a quiet wind that seemed to carry the scent of sawdust and gratitude. Jonah sat on the bench as the crowd clapped, his hand resting over the carved words. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel fragile. He felt whole. But every high note hides an echo. That night, when everyone had gone home, Jonah lingered in the workshop alone. The silence was deep, and the air carried a strange heaviness. He coughed once, twice, and felt something twist in his chest. He brushed it off, blaming the sawdust. But when the pain returned sharper, his body folded forward. The next morning, Mia found him on the floor, pale and breathing shallow. The world that had felt so steady cracked open again. At the hospital, the lights were the same cold fluorescent color as before. History was repeating itself, cruelly and inevitably. Doctor Patel appeared at the foot of the bed, his face grave but kind. "It's a relapse," he said, quietly. "We'll do everything we can." Mia's heart sank. She sat beside Jonah, clutching his hand the way she had the first time. "You promised you'd keep building," she whispered. He opened his eyes, weak but clear, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I am," he murmured. "Just not with wood this time." His words hung in the air, heavy, beautiful, terrifying. Outside, the town went about its day, unaware that the man who'd taught them to make meaning from mistakes was now facing his greatest one yet, the possibility of goodbye. The beeping of the monitor was steady, almost polite, as if it didn't want to disturb the room's fragile silence. Jonah lay there again, pale under the hospital's fluorescent light, his chest rising and falling like a fragile metronome. Mia sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly round his. She couldn't stop staring at the small scar on his wrist, a reminder of the first time they'd been in this very position. The circle of pain had closed again, and it felt merciless. But something was different this time. The fear was still there, yes, but so was something sturdier, a quiet faith that hadn't existed before. The town, the students, even Dr. Patel seemed to carry it. Jonah had changed more than himself. He'd changed the ecosystem around him. Love had become contagious. When Dr. Patel came in, Mia braced herself for the usual clinical update, but instead he said something unexpected. "You know," he began softly, "we've seen patients like Jonah before, but I've rarely seen someone transform the way he has. Whatever happens next, that's real medicine too." Mia nodded through tears. "He taught us that," she whispered. Jonah stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Talking about me again." His voice was barely there, a breath pretending to be a joke. Mia laughed, even through the ache. "Always," he smiled weakly. "Good." "Ache being left out." Dr. Patel grinned. "You'll have to stay awake to keep us honest." For days, Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fevered dreams. He spoke to people who weren't there. His father, a younger version of himself, maybe even ghosts of all the things he hadn't finished building. Mia stayed. She read aloud from books he used to love, woodworking guides, poetry collections, even old letters from clients who'd written to thank him for his craftsmanship. Clara visited too. She came every evening after work, sometimes with tea, sometimes with silence. On one of those evenings, she brought a small wooden carving, a miniature version of the still here bench. She placed it by his bedside. "For when you forget," she whispered. Jonah saw it the next morning. His eyes softened. "You made that," Clara nodded. "You inspired it." He reached out slowly, his trembling hand brushing against it. "Guess the lesson stuck," he said, smiling faintly. For a brief time, hope returned. The fever broke. His appetite came back, and Dr. Patel spoke cautiously about recovery. Mia began to dream again. Of home, of spring, of light returning through the workshop windows. She told Jonah about the students still coming by to check in, about the mayor planning to name the park bench after him. Jonah chuckled at that. "They better spell my name right this time," he said, and the room filled with laughter that felt like sunlight. But healing is a strange thing. It doesn't always announce when it's done. Some recoveries are temporary, not because love wasn't strong enough, but because bodies have their own secret timelines. Late one night, while the hospital slept, Jonah woke in a sudden stillness. The pain was gone, completely gone, and for a moment he thought he'd been cured. He looked at Mia, asleep in the chair beside him, her face soft under the blue light. He wanted to wake her, to tell her how grateful he was. But something in him whispered, "Let her rest." He looked at the tiny bench on the table. "Still here," he murmured. "Yeah, I am," the monitor hummed, gentle, rhythmic. His breathing slowed. There was no fear this time, no struggle, just a deep exhale that sounded almost like relief. When Mia woke moments later, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The machine had stopped beeping. She reached for his hand, still warm, but still. And in that instant, she felt the strangest thing. Not the sharp, tearing grief she expected, but an immense calm. Because she knew he hadn't lost. He'd built something that would outlive him. The funeral was simple, as Jonah would have wanted. The town came. His students carried the small birdhouses they'd made under his guidance and hung them on the trees surrounding the park. Each one swayed gently in the wind, tiny testaments to the hands that had once taught them. Clara spoke briefly. "He didn't teach us how to build things," she said. "He taught us how to build ourselves." Mia couldn't speak. Her throat refused words. Instead, she placed the miniature bench, Clara's carving, on his casket. and whispered, still here. It wasn't goodbye. It was a promise. Weeks passed and spring returned. The workshop became a community space. Jonah's students decided to keep it open, to continue teaching in his name. They called it the Jonah Project. Mia visited often, helping organize classes, sanding wood, telling newcomers about the man who believed love could be a kind of medicine. One afternoon, as she locked up, a boy from the new class stopped her. "Miss Mia," he said shyly, "did you know Jonah?" She smiled. "Better than anyone." He said love was like glue. The boy continued, grinning, "that it holds everything together, even when the pieces don't fit." Mia laughed through tears. "Yeah," she whispered. "That sounds like him." As she stepped outside, she looked toward the park. The bench, withered now, still stood, surrounded by wildflowers. A couple sat there, holding hands, unaware of its story. The sight filled her chest with warmth and ache all at once. Mia sat on the grass and watched the sparrows dart between the birdhouses. For a moment, she could almost hear Jonah's voice again, calm, playful, steady. "Keep building anyway." The sun dipped low, painting the workshop in gold. And in that light, Mia finally understood. Love hadn't failed to heal Jonah. It had simply finished its work. Because healing doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means teaching others how to go on. And Jonah, even gone, was still here.